All right, welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're taking a look at Introduction to the Study of the Hindu Doctrines by René Guénon.
Okay.
You sent this one in because you're interested in getting a better grasp of Hindu thought, right?
Yes.
So our mission here is pretty straightforward. We're going to pull out those core ideas and distinctions Guénon makes in this book,
Hmm.
kind of give you like a shortcut, straight into his perspective.
Absolutely.
Now, just a little background. This book was published back in 1945 in London, and it's really meant as an introduction, right, to those fundamental aspects of Hindu doctrines,
Yeah.
especially when you compare them to, the way Westerners think.
Right, right.
And just looking at his other work, Guénon was clearly fascinated by comparing Eastern and Western viewpoints. He wrote East and West, for instance.
Hmm.
He also dove into the challenges of the modern world, the crisis of the modern world, and of course explored Vedanta philosophy. He has a book on that as well.
Yeah, he was quite prolific. A lot of really interesting stuff.
So this book is really part of that bigger intellectual puzzle he was putting together.
Definitely.
Now, our goal today is to keep things clear, avoid getting lost in the jargon,
Right.
and really highlight some of those maybe unexpected aspects of Hindu thought that Guénon presents.
Sounds good.
Okay, let's just jump right in with a term that might seem simple at first, but, it's actually pretty loaded. Hindu. What does it actually mean?
Right. Guénon really tackles this head on. And I think what's so interesting is he argues that it shouldn't just be a geographical term, you know.
Like you're from India, so you're Hindu.
Exactly. Or even a racial category, right?
Mm-hmm.
He says it goes deeper than that. It's about adherence to the Hindu tradition, embracing the doctrines, the associated social structures.
It's about alignment then, not just where you're from.
Exactly. Intellectual and spiritual alignment.
Which makes a lot of sense when you think about how diverse India is.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, Guénon even points out that it's more like a continent than a single European nation in terms of its sheer size, all those different languages and cultures.
It's huge.
Yeah, immense.
And even with that incredible diversity, Guénon highlights that the unity within the Hindu tradition, it wasn't enforced from the top down.
Like, you don't have a single religious authority calling all of the shots.
Exactly. Like
Yeah.
you might see in the West with, say, the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
He suggests this unity was mainly maintained by the inherent strength, the coherence of the doctrine itself.
So it's the power of the ideas themselves,
Right.
not some external organization holding everything together.
Precisely.
That's a really key insight, I think. And it kind of leads into why he says terms like Hindu Buddhism or Indian Muslims, they don't quite work from a Hindu doctrinal perspective.
Yeah, because from that perspective, those terms are actually a contradiction.
You can't be both.
Right. If someone really adheres to Buddhist or Islamic doctrines, they're operating within a different framework than the Hindu tradition, as Guénon defines it.
The core principles are just different.
Yes, distinct.
He also mentions, though, that the tradition we now call Hindu probably existed under different names way before that specific term caught on.
Yeah, it's like a river flowing through different landscapes, being called different names along the way, but it's still the same fundamental flow.
Love that analogy. Same water, different names.
Exactly.
And he dives into that historical split in the Indo-Iranian branch, pointing out how the Hindu tradition developed on its own independently.
Yeah, and that historical context is so important, I think, for understanding its unique path.
Right, because he also cautions against using Hindu just as a label to categorize periods of Indian civilization.
Like Vedic, then Brahmanical, then Hindu.
Yeah, as if they were totally separate things with no connection, right?
Because he argues that these underlying traditional principles, they maintained this fundamental unity throughout those periods.
Even if the outward expressions might have shifted, right?
Exactly. The core essence remained consistent.
So, just to recap for our listener, Hindu, for Guénon, signifies adherence to a particular tradition, its doctrines, not just geography or ancestry. And this tradition has a long, continuous history.
Deep roots.
All right, let's move on to another big concept Guénon brings up. The perpetuity of the Veda.
Okay.
What's the key takeaway here?
This is where things get really fascinating. Guénon presents the Veda not as the work of a single author at a specific point in time. Right?
Not like, Shakespeare wrote Hamlet.
Exactly. He even suggests that Vyasa, often credited with compiling the Veda, might actually represent an intellectual collective rather than one individual.
So it's less about authorship and more about embodying this timeless, primordial tradition.
That's it. It's the Veda as a living, breathing entity.
Not a static text.
Right.
And he really stresses the role of oral transmission here.
Absolutely. He points out that the Veda existed orally for millennia before it was written down, and that oral tradition has been crucial to its preservation.
Powerful reminder that knowledge isn't always tied to the written word.
Definitely.
He describes the Veda as this foundational, traditional knowledge, the basis for other, more derived branches of doctrine.
It's like the taproot of a giant tree, nourishing all the other parts.
Perfect analogy.
And because of this, Guénon argues that trying to pin down a precise chronological order of development within the Vedic texts is kind of missing the point.
It's less about the timeline and more about the underlying unity, right?
Exactly. Grasping the core ideas that have always coexisted.
Interesting. Now, this idea of foundational principles leads us right into the distinction between orthodoxy and heterodoxy.
Okay.
How does Guénon define these terms within a traditional context?
Well, he suggests that in traditional civilizations, those core principles are never really lost sight of.
They're always there.
Right. And any deviations from those fundamental understandings, they're seen as pretty rare, almost like anomalies.
Mm-hmm. There's this emphasis on sticking with the established wisdom.
Definitely.
And he brings up a really interesting example, the concept of atomism.
Yeah, that's a good one. He mentions atomism as something that might seem heterodox at first glance, from the perspective of the Veda.
Like it doesn't fit in.
Right. But he points out that it eventually got integrated, absorbed within certain schools of thought, within the broader Hindu tradition.
So there's this flexibility there, right?
It's not about rejecting all new ideas outright. It's about seeing if they can be assimilated, as long as they don't fundamentally contradict those essential principles.
Makes sense. And he makes a pretty strong statement about heterodoxy in India, right?
Yeah, he says that when something really contradicts those essential principles, heterodoxy and absurdity, they're almost the same thing.
Like there's a clear line in the sand.
Right. It's about maintaining a coherent understanding of reality within the tradition.
Okay, now let's turn to something that often causes a lot of discussion and sometimes confusion. Buddhism.
All right.
What's Guénon's take on it from this Hindu doctrinal perspective?
What's fascinating here is that Guénon, working from that Hindu perspective, he sees Buddhism as something that arose within a Hindu intellectual and cultural environment.
So it didn't just appear out of nowhere.
Right. He argues it shares a lot of fundamental features with Hinduism, and he essentially positions it as an offshoot.
Which might surprise some people, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
In the West, they're often seen as totally separate, even opposing.
Yeah, totally.
And he points out that historically, Buddhism eventually vanished from India itself.
It's not a major presence there anymore.
Exactly. And this leads him to question that typical Western, Orientalist view.
That sees Buddhism as completely separate and maybe even influencing Hinduism.
Yeah, like the idea that Hindus borrowed from Greek philosophy to, hold their own against Buddhism.
He's suggesting it might have been the other way around then.
Or at least that the relationship was way more complex, intertwined.
Not a simple one-way street.
Right.
And he touches on a bigger issue for Westerners trying to understand Eastern thought in general, right?
Absolutely. He implies that Westerners, with our own mental frameworks and historical experiences, we might have a hard time really grasping the subtle nuances.
It's hard to step outside your own perspective.
It is. And this can lead to some big misunderstandings about Hinduism and Buddhism and their relationship.
So important to be aware of that when we study other traditions.
Definitely.
Now, another core concept Guénon dives into is the law of Manu, or Dharma.
Okay.
Can you break down what this means according to the text?
This is a huge one. Guénon explains that dharma, which comes from the Sanskrit root tree, meaning to support or to uphold, refers to the very essence of a being.
It's like their core nature.
Exactly. It includes all their inherent qualities, characteristics, how they act within their given circumstances, both individually and as part of a larger group.
So it's not just like rules or laws in a legal sense.
No. It's way more fundamental. It's connected to the very being of something.
And he ties this directly to the natural order.
Right. Exactly. Dharma signifies conformity with that inherent natural order of the universe. Adhering to your own dharma means maintaining that equilibrium, that harmony within yourself and the cosmos.
So it's like being in tune with the universe.
Yes, precisely.
And what about its opposite, adharma? How does he define that?
Well, he's careful to point out that it's not exactly the same as sin or evil in that Western moral sense.
Interesting.
Instead, it signifies nonconformity, imbalance, actions that disrupt that universal order, that harmony.
It's like being out of sync.
Yes, it's about being out of alignment with your essential nature and the natural order.
So it's not a moral judgment, it's more about cosmic consequences.
Precisely.
And the law of Manu itself, it's not just a social code, right?
No, Guenon presents it as this fundamental principle of the cosmic order and the cyclical nature of, existence itself. It's way bigger than just a set of social or legal laws in the Western sense.
It's about how reality itself is structured.
Yes, and how everything functions within that structure.
He also distinguishes between different kinds of texts within the tradition, right, in relation to Dharma.
Yes, he talks about Shruti and Smriti.
Tell me more about that.
Well, he describes the Vedic texts, known as Shruti, as representing direct intellectual intuition.
Like a direct connection to the truth.
Exactly, and a reflection of that rational order.
Right.
Whereas traditional writings like Dharmashastra or Smriti, including the law of Manu, they're seen as reflections and elaborations of that primary intuition.
So they're building upon that foundation.
Right, providing those guiding principles for life.
Okay, so Dharma is this fundamental principle of being and acting in accordance with the cosmic order. And the law of Manu embodies that on this grand scale.
Absolutely.
Now, let's move into a potentially sensitive area. The principles behind caste.
Right.
How does Guénon present this within the context of Hindu doctrine?
It's really important to understand that he approaches caste, or varna, as a social function determined by the inherent nature of each individual human being.
So it's not arbitrary.
No. He notes that yati, or birth, is a primary factor in determining that nature.
So where you're born into matters.
It does. Think of varna as that broad functional category, like teacher or warrior, reflecting those inherent qualities.
Okay.
While jati is your specific birth group within that varna, often linked to your lineage.
So like a family tradition almost.
Yes, in a way.
And he points out that the term varna originally meant color or quality, right?
Yes, suggesting these inherent tendencies, aptitudes you're born with.
Like a predisposition.
Exactly.
And heredity plays a huge role.
Huge. Through jati and gotra, which is lineage.
So understanding someone's fundamental nature, then, is key to assigning them their place and function within this social organization.
Absolutely. It's about figuring out where you fit in based on who you are.
And this social organization is seen as hierarchical.
It is. But Guénon argues that this hierarchy isn't arbitrary. It reflects those inherent differences in the nature of beings, their dharma.
So different beings, different capacities, different roles to play.
Precisely. It's all about maintaining that overall social harmony.
And this whole concept of dharma implies that you can't just change your fundamental nature or social function at will.
Right. It's not about picking and choosing.
You are who you are.
In a sense, yes.
He describes the four varnas, Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra, using that symbolic language connected to the universal man, or Purusha from the Rig Veda. Can you break this down?
Of course. So the Brahmana, associated with the mouth of Purusha, represents that spiritual authority, the function of teaching and preserving sacred knowledge.
The keepers of wisdom.
Exactly. The Kshatriya, from the arms, embodies that administrative and military power, the role of protection and governance.
The protectors.
Yes. Then the Vaishya, from the thighs, they represent those economic functions, agriculture, commerce, trade.
The producers.
Right. And finally, the Shudra, from the feet, signifies service and providing the necessary support for the other three varnas.
The foundation.
Yes, in a way.
And he mentions that full participation in the tradition is really only for the first three castes, who are considered twice-born or dvija.
Right.
What does that mean exactly?
This twice-born concept involves a spiritual initiation, signifying a deeper engagement with the tradition.
It's like a next level of understanding.
Yes, a further unfolding of their potential within their varna.
So it's about more than just being born into a certain caste.
Exactly.
All right, so caste is presented as this system rooted in inherent nature and hereditary qualities, leading to that hierarchical social organization reflecting the cosmic order. Now, let's talk about Shaivism and Vishnuism within these Hindu doctrines.
Okay.
How are they explained?
Guenon explains that the supreme principle, what in the West we often call God, is understood in Hindu doctrine as being both impersonal and personal.
That's interesting. Both at the same time.
Yes.
Yeah.
In its ultimate metaphysical sense, it's beyond any specific attributes or limitations. That's Brahma in its absolute undifferentiated state.
Pure being.
Right. However, For us to understand it for manifestation, it's conceived with attributes.
So we can relate to it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's Ishwara or Saguna Brahma, Brahma with qualities, the personal aspect of the divine.
So it's a paradox, really, both beyond us and yet also relatable.
Yes, exactly.
And he talks about the use of human-like forms in religious symbolism, right? Anthropomorphism.
Yes, he suggests that's a necessary concession to the limitations of human understanding. It's a support for meditation, for devotion.
We need something to focus on.
Right. But he's very clear that those symbols shouldn't be taken literally. They're not meant to be finite descriptions of the infinite.
So don't get too caught up in the imagery.
Exactly.
He also points out the complementary functions of Vishnu and Shiva, those two major deities.
Yes, Vishnu and Shiva represent different but complementary aspects of that one divine principle.
So they're not competing.
No, they work together. Vishnu is often associated with preservation and order, while Shiva is associated with transformation and dissolution.
Two sides of the same coin.
Exactly. They represent that dynamic balance in the cosmos.
And he introduces the concept of Shakti as well.
Yes, Shakti is presented as that divine energy, the power through which the supreme principle manifests the universe.
The creative force.
Right. It's often associated with the feminine aspects of the divine.
Like the mother goddess.
And it's embodied in various goddesses like Lakshmi, Saraswati, and Parvati.
Each with their own specific qualities.
Exactly. Okay, so we've got a complex understanding of the divine principle with both impersonal and personal aspects represented through all these different deities and energies.
A rich tapestry.
Now let's shift gears and talk about the many different points of view within the doctrine itself.
All right.
Does Guenon see this multiplicity as a problem?
No, not at all. He actually sees it as a strength. He argues that it's not a sign of weakness or fragmentation, but rather a natural consequence of the doctrine's universality.
There's room for different perspectives.
Absolutely. He points out that people have different intellectual capacities and temperaments, so one size doesn't fit all.
Exactly. And he contrasts this with the Western tendency to create those rigid, mutually exclusive systems of thought.
You're either right or you're wrong.
Right. He suggests that Eastern thought tends to be more flexible, more synthetic.
Allowing for different perspectives to coexist.
Exactly. Not seeing them as inherently contradictory.
And he mentions the 6 darshanas, those schools of thought within Hindu philosophy.
Yes, he briefly introduces those 6. Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Sankhya, Yoga, Mimamsa, and Vedanta.
6 different ways of looking at things.
He emphasizes that they represent different but ultimately compatible viewpoints on the nature of reality and the path to liberation.
So let's break those down a bit. If we were looking at the concept of, say, self, how would each of these darshanas approach it?
Well, the Nyaya, essentially a school of logic, they might analyze the concept of self through logical arguments and valid means of knowledge.
So reason your way to an understanding.
Right. Vaisheshika introduces this system of categories, or padarthas, like substance, quality, and action. So they might try to categorize the self within their broader system.
Putting it in its proper place.
Yes. Yoga, particularly Patanjali's Yoga Shastra, focuses on the experiential realization of the true self through meditative practices.
It's about directly experiencing it.
Exactly. Mimamsa, concerned with the effect of actions, might analyze how our actions shape our understanding and experience of self.
So your actions have consequences for who you become.
Right. And finally, Vedanta, focused on the Upanishads, would emphasize the illusory nature of the individual self and the realization of the ultimate self, Atman Brahman.
So going beyond the limit itself to something greater.
Precisely.
Okay, that gives a much clearer picture of how each school approaches things differently. Now, Guénon also has some additional thoughts he shares about the doctrine.
He does.
What stands out there?
Well, he touches on this idea that traditional sciences in the East, like Ayurveda, traditional medicine, are connected to a deeper, more metaphysical understanding of the universe.
As opposed to Western science, which he often criticizes for being too materialistic, right?
Exactly. He sees it as having become divorced from those deeper considerations.
And he also comments on Western attempts to understand these traditions, right?
Yes, he suggests that analyzing them solely through empirical or materialistic methods just won't cut it.
Because you're missing a key dimension.
Exactly. Those essential metaphysical and spiritual dimensions.
So we need to expand our methods.
Absolutely.
Okay, now how is this traditional knowledge actually passed on? Let's talk about traditional teaching itself.
Right.
What are its characteristics, according to Guenon?
Well, he emphasizes that it's not just about, absorbing information intellectually.
It's not just reading a book.
No. It's a process. It's handed down under specific conditions, tailored to the individual's capacity.
So it's very personalized.
Very much so. And it requires real effort from the disciple and a deep bond between the teacher or guru and the student.
It's a relationship.
Absolutely.
He talks about an initiation and a second birth as well.
Yes, this transmission often involves an initiation. It's a significant step in the disciple's journey, second birth, into that intellectual and spiritual realm guided by the teacher.
So it's transformational.
It is.
And he contrasts this Oriental way with the Western approach to learning, right?
He sees them as fundamentally different. He highlights the importance of that direct oral transmission from a living teacher.
Not just learning from books.
Right. And the necessity of practical realization of the knowledge.
So putting it into practice.
Exactly. Not just understanding it theoretically.
And he addresses some common criticisms of this approach, right?
He does. Those Western criticisms, about traditional teaching being esoteric or anti-democratic because it's not available to everyone.
Yeah, like it's exclusive.
He addresses that by pointing out that people have different aptitudes.
Not everyone is ready for the same level of teaching.
Exactly. And there are dangers in spreading profound knowledge indiscriminately.
It's about respecting the depth of the material.
And the need for proper guidance.
Now, finally, Guénon critiques various Western interpretations of Eastern thought.
Okay.
Let's start with official Orientalism. What's his main issue with it?
He's very critical of it. He sees it as inadequate, often based on preconceived notions, rather than a genuine attempt to understand.
Look, they've already made up their minds.
Right. He suggests that it often reduces these rich traditions to historical or linguistic curiosities.
And missing the deeper meaning.
Exactly. He calls it a lack of intellectual probity.
He doesn't hold back.
Not at all.
What about the science of religions?
He criticizes that too. He sees it as trying to force all traditions into this single naturalistic framework.
Like a one-size-fits-all approach.
Right, often driven by evolutionary theories and a misunderstanding of symbolism and metaphysics.
They're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Exactly. And he specifically criticizes concepts like fetishism and animism.
Those are pretty loaded terms.
They are. He sees them as Western projections that fail to grasp the true significance of these concepts within their own contexts.
So again, it's about imposing a Western framework onto something that operates on different principles.
Precisely.
Next up, Theosophism. What's his beef with that?
He describes it as a confused and distorted representation of Eastern ideas, mixed with Western occultism.
So it's not the real deal.
No, he sees it as lacking genuine understanding. And he's concerned about its popularity because he feels it creates these misleading illusions that hinder real comprehension.
So it's spreading misinformation.
In a way, yes. He specifically challenges theosophical interpretations of karma and reincarnation.
Those are big concepts.
They are, and he feels they're often misrepresented.
So basically, he sees Theosophism as a superficial mishmash.
That's a good way to put it.
All right, what about Vedanta westernized?
He criticizes that for being a superficial and sentimentalized adaptation.
Losing the essence of the original?
Exactly. He feels it caters to Western intellectual trends while missing the depth and rigor of the real teachings.
So it's been watered down.
Yes.
And he makes some final remarks on Western interpretations in general.
He does.
What's the gist there?
He reiterates the difficulty Westerners have in truly understanding Eastern thought.
Because of those fundamental differences we talked about earlier?
Exactly. Those differences in mentalities, languages, and philosophical frameworks.
We're coming from different worlds.
In a way, yes. And he points out the limitations of Western scholarly methods when applied to traditional metaphysics.
So we need a different approach.
Absolutely.
Wow, this has been a really insightful look into Guénon's introduction to the study of the Hindu doctrines. We've covered so much.
We have.
From the meaning of Hindu and the Vedas' significance to the complexities of Dharma and caste, all those philosophical viewpoints, and finally his critique of Western interpretations.
A lot to unpack. We explored Guénon's perspective on the Hindu tradition's core identity, the Vedas' enduring power, the principles of orthodoxy, how he uniquely positions Buddhism, that all-encompassing Dharma, the caste system's functional understanding, the dual nature of the supreme principle, the strength in diversity, traditional teaching, and of course his critique of Western misunderstandings.
It really makes you think about how these differences in Eastern and Western thought might still be shaping our understanding of non-Western traditions today.
Definitely.
How often do we approach ancient wisdom with our own modern Western assumptions?
It's something to be very mindful of.
It is. And this deep dive has been a great starting point, but there's so much more to explore based on these insights.
A whole world of thought out there.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
My pleasure.